How will the United States lose its superpower status? My guest today says slowly, and then all at once. Now, while most people today are focused on today's headlines, what Trump did or what President Xi said, my guest today argues that the outcome of this conflict was decided long before either opponent entered the ring. His name is Warwick Powell. He's a veteran geopolitical analyst with a focus on China, who spent years advising governments on how geopolitics affects their natural resource strategy. You're going to enjoy this episode. Here is Warwick Powell.
This is Jay Martin.
I'm excited to have you back on, Warwick. It's good to see you again. And there's like 5-10 different directions I want to go today. So we're going to jam a lot in, but I'm looking forward to this.
Let's go.
So here's where I want to start. I know you just got back from Beijing on the heels of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. This is the 5th summit they've hosted and by far the biggest. I think over 20 nations participated this year. And there was a lot of, I almost want to call it performative pieces to this summit. Obviously, lots of candid photos of Modi, Putin, and Xi shaking hands and holding hands and laughing together. An official from South Korea shaking hands with Kim Jong-un on stage. And it struck me as a demonstration by President Xi that this is the role we now play in the world. We're the home to the disenfranchised. We're the home to the forgotten. Now, this has been a long time coming, but you just got back from Beijing. Before I hit record, you were talking about the sort of global response to that summit. Let's start there. What has been the global response? What's been valid? What's been sensationalized?
Look, I think the response has been a bit of a mixed bag. There's a tendency to want to dismiss what's going on in the global south, so to speak. And that has been the case for quite a number of years. And that, in large part, I think, reflects a process of adjustment to new realities. So displacement anxiety amongst former global hegemons leads commentators and politicians to, in a sense, not want to confront the changing world. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, the SCO summit, in part reflects and consolidates the nature of the changes and the direction of the changes. The nature of the changes is one that sees the global south, and in this particular case, the countries across the Eurasian continent, extending their collaborative relationships and the institutions that they've been building over the last 20-odd years around mainly security questions to do with terrorism and extremism, to now extending from that to build economic and financial collaborative institutions. So there's a very important shift that is taking place in terms of the substance of the change. We see out of the SCO summit the ongoing commitments around infrastructure collaborations in transport and energy, as well as in information and communication systems, much of which was not properly or well reported or widely reported in the Western English language mainstream media, much to the disadvantage of people, I think, who are needing to understand the dynamics of the world. And the other thing that is happening at a financial level with the SCO is the announcements of an SCO development bank. And that these two things combined, infrastructure development and financial services infrastructure development, really says that the SCO is migrating from an organisation focused around coordinating responses to terrorism risks and extremism risks and separatist risks to one that is far deeper and which sees the future long-run security and prosperity of its member states as being, in a sense, a full-stack proposition. The optics, increasingly these sorts of global events are run with half an eye to the optics. If you think back 20-odd years ago, I don't think anybody really paid that much attention to the optics, other than the niceties of diplomatic protocol. But these days, with the eyes of the world through social media, real-time broadcasting, commentators everywhere, these events become as much about message projection as they are about the substance of things. And you're absolutely right that some of the key imagery, in particular, that was curated at the event was aimed at sending some important messages. Now, how those messages are received and interpreted, I think, does vary a bit. But I think from an SCO point of view, the message is that the countries of the member states, the Eurasian countries, are willing and able to find common ground, notwithstanding differences that they may have. And so that was really the Modi Xi détente, and being able to do that. The shaking of the hands of the two Koreas was really a message, in a sense, to say, look, once again, these are the kind of formats that enable parties who have been engaged in long-standing disputes to begin to find ways of engaging. And without engaging, you actually don't have a way of navigating, hopefully, towards a long-term peaceful resolution of whatever the conflicts were about. So I think they're the real main messages. Now, from a Western media perspective, the SCO was in part, again, dismissed. There was a lot of concern, nonetheless, with the signals that came out of Modi's outreach to China and the context that happened, which of course was within the sort of week and a half of the US announcements of additional tariffs on Indian products, and President Trump's description of India as a dead economy or something along those lines. So I think the SCO, partly through coincidence of timing, but also partly through an increasing sensibility amongst the people involved, the parties, the individuals, and of course their teams, to with an eye to the optics, was really announcing to the world that the global south, or at least the northern hemisphere, Eurasian part of the global south, was here and was here to stay.
So thank you for that. Now, a few things that I want to pull on there. First, I want to understand the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Development Bank a little bit better. You referenced the SCO Development Bank, and you mentioned security and sort of counter-terrorist activities as part of their initiatives. And I was curious, is this some kind of a version 2 of the Belt and Road Initiative? You know, since 2013 via the Chinese Development Bank and another bank, I'm failing on the name, in China, they've delivered around $1 trillion in infrastructure loans to 103 countries around the world. And this has been sort of their bridge to the future. We're going to elevate the next generation of consumers by building the ports, the bridges, the roads, the mines, the refineries, the water treatment plants, whatever you need to elevate up in society so that you can purchase Chinese goods. I mean, that was one angle on it, because the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, was, from my understanding, launched after China suffered greatly in 2008 when Europe and America stopped buying their goods in such quantity. So they looked to secure future consumer bases. I always looked at the BRI as a parallel to the Americans' weapons diplomacy. So if the BRI is delivering infrastructure loans to 103 countries around the world, well, the U.S. sells weapons to 97 countries around the world. So it's kind of like they're securing alliance with weaponry, they're securing alliance with infrastructure, but it's sort of two strategies run with the same goal in mind, future alliances in the event of a global conflict. How does that mature? Does that mature into the SCO Development Bank, and how did things change? And am I completely off base by saying this is the next version of the BRI?
Look, I think it adds another layer to the BRI. Let's not forget that the BRI was launched in Central Asia in 2013, and it built on the historic idea of the Silk Road, which connected China with Europe, and then there was a maritime Silk Road as well. So the BRI really was, as you say, an infrastructure-driven initiative from China that served a broad range of objectives. One was that it enabled the laying out of the infrastructure needed to support trade, because without that, you're never going to be able to move things. So you need ports, you need railroads, you need roads, you need airports, because without those, you're not going to be able to move things from A to B. Once those things are built, you're able then to intensify the trading relationships, and that creates a secondary market then for Chinese materials and goods and products. But it also enables the developing countries to move things at greater scale to China. One of the challenges for many countries in dealing with China is that the Chinese market is huge. China is about 17% of the world's population. And for most other countries, well, actually, bar one, India, which is slightly larger than China, that is an immense undertaking to be able to service that. Many organizations, companies, enterprises in particularly the developing world simply don't have the scale capabilities somewhere in their supply chains to meet the kinds of demands that come from servicing a market like China's. And so rolling out this kind of infrastructure was a necessary precondition for China to be able to tap into these economies and access the things that they've got that the Chinese economy itself doesn't have or doesn't have in sufficient volume, whether it's in the arena of natural resources or in things like food, fruits, grains, etc., etc. So that was layer number one. With that layer kind of being largely built out, we are now moving into a second era, if you will, and that is to create the capabilities for this infrastructure to be exploited. And that means building up enterprises and creating systems that enable production and goods and services to flow smoothly. And this means information systems. And so one of the things that came out of the SCA summit was actually some joint commitments around information technologies, communication systems. And secondly, the embedding of that information system into supply chain networks. Overlaying all of this is the finance layer. So the finance layer is needed to continue to support some infrastructure development, particularly in the energy arena, because that is one area that will require continued augmentation as these developing economies continue to develop. Underpinning development is actually energy. So without expanding energy systems, you don't actually get development. So that comes first in a sense. So we're going to see financial support geared towards energy systems development. And again, it's a very diverse array of energy capabilities, from nuclear capabilities all the way through to microgrids, renewable energies, batteries, large-scale wind turbines, and those sorts of things. We're then going to see financing of the enterprises themselves. So as enterprises expand, they need to have capital, working capital, to procure inputs and to pay for their resourcing, the staff and the energy that they're going to use to satisfy the growing demands. The infrastructure bank, which is what the SCA bank's going to focus upon, will really help leverage the existing infrastructure that's been put into place and support the ongoing expansion of other economies, in part so that they can take better advantage of the Chinese marketplace. So when China says it is seeking to open up more and to play the role of a buyer in the global marketplace, for that to happen, the supply side actually needs to be boosted at the same time. And that's what I think this sort of financing is really focused upon.
Okay. Now, could I call on a real world example where some of this has already played out? And I'm in Indonesia right now. Can I use Indonesia and the nickel industry? Indonesia's been a major player in the nickel sector for a long time, but for the majority of that time, they were just exporting cheap, raw nickel ore because they didn't have the refining capability in country. And I think it was President Widodo who tried to create sort of like an OPEC style nickel association, which would have been Indonesia, Canada, and Australia, where most of the world's nickel comes from. But the idea fell flat. Nobody would participate. Instead, what ended up happening is China financed to the tune of $65 billion Indonesia's nickel refining industry. And as of today, Indonesia supplies about 65% of the world's refined nickel. Now, for context, OPEC at its peak in 1973 supplied 55% of the world's oil. So 65 is a lot. And if anybody wants to pull up a chart of the nickel price, you'll see what's happened here. Indonesia has flooded the world with cheap nickel, cheaper than Australia or Canada can produce because of Indonesian labor prices, dropping the price below what is sustainable for Canada or Australia, putting many of those mines now on care and maintenance, and Indonesia is eating up a larger piece of the pie in response. They're projected to hit like 75% plus of the refined nickel sector by 2029, like not very far, and it looks like they'll hit it. Once you've cornered the market to the tune of 75%, guess what you do to prices, right? You move them in your favor. And so is this an example? And because all of that infrastructure was built with Chinese money, the refineries are in play, the product is being moved, the structure is there. This is an example of exactly what you're discussing, Warwick. Is that correct?
In part it is, because, and the nickel case I think is really interesting, Jay, because when the attempts to create this raw materials nickel OPEC floundered, the Indonesian government did not give up on its own ambitions to secure the long-term prosperity of its nickel sector. And it introduced policies that significantly encouraged Chinese investment, as it turned out, to contribute to the development of value-adding capability in Indonesia. And that really tilted the market into the favour of Indonesian-based mines and, of course, Indonesian-based processors. The lesson learned out of all of this is, and this is perhaps the lesson to be learned by Australia and Canada, is that when opportunities arise to essentially collaborate and to strengthen one's bargaining position, if you will, in global markets, then these are things that probably should be looked at a lot more seriously, number one. And number two is to recognise that China, as one of the biggest customers in the world for raw materials, is also likely to be one of the most obvious investors in value-adding development.
Right.
And Indonesia grabbed that opportunity with two hands, and all credit to them. Now, obviously, people in the West in particular raise or continue to raise issues around environmental standards and work standards in Indonesia, but you know, those considerations aside, it is quite clear that the Indonesian raw materials and now downstream value-adding capabilities has put these resources in Indonesia in the box seat. Yes. To service Chinese supply chains further downstream.
And I could guess. Well, I could guess why Canada slept on that opportunity. It's not lost on me. The country's been lost for 12 years, from my opinion. And I'm less familiar with Australian politics, but I imagine they might be sort of comparable, shunning the extraction industries and projecting virtues of our renewable future.
Well, the other issue there, I think, is, look, the Australian metals industry has actually pockets of downstream value adding, but for decades upon decades, there's always been talk about trying to develop more downstream value adding out of the metalliferous sector in Australia, but it's never come to fruition, in large part because the capital commitments required are substantial, as you understand, and there have been few corporations in Australia willing to commit to that. Those who own the rights to the resources are just as happy mining them and selling them. They've got no reason in and of themselves to take on what they would see as additional risk and burden to develop downstream value-adding capabilities. You put all of these things together and you can see why those who mine um, are not that committed to doing anything else beyond mining, and without substantial, what I think becomes very clear anyway, is that without substantial public support in one shape or another around things like transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and things like that, the business case is very, very difficult when you are trying to explain to shareholders on quarterly cycles why you're making these massive capex commitments.
Right.
And so it doesn't happen. And 10 years later, nations live with a bunch of regret.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you do about that?
Well,
We've seen in Australia downstream copper refineries come to the end of their economic life and close down. Interestingly, we do have in Australia a very viable zinc refinery in North Queensland, which over the last 10 years actually transitioned to renewable energy driven, which is very interesting because zinc is an electricity intensive processing activity. So I think it is a horses for courses question as to how it is that a business case can be made for downstream metals value adding in advanced economies like Australia and Canada. It depends on topography and where you are in the world and the nature of the resources that you've got available. But I think the structure of economies and particularly the fact that many of the mining companies have zero interest in downstream value adding just makes it very, very hard. And in steps, countries like Indonesia, plenty of natural resources, seeking capital, and downstream users of that natural resource are your obvious investment partners.
Yes, yes, yes. And I think Australia has done a much better job than Canada over the last decade. Actually, I'll be at the International Mining and Resources Conference, the IMARC, in Sydney, October 21st through 23rd. So if anyone's going to be there, drop me a note in the comments. I'd love to chat. So if I were to think forward in these layers, as you've explained, we've locked up some key trade infrastructure. Effectively, we've built the infrastructure to create the supply and receive the demand. Where's the layer that allows transactions to occur outside of the US dollar system? And how was that discussed in any sincerity at the SCO Summit 2025? And could you bridge this for us, Warwick, between the infrastructure and the transactions?
Look, one of the things to think, a way of visualizing, I guess, what's happening is the creation of the infrastructure that enables value to flow. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, value, in essence, takes two forms, and these two forms coexist. One is things that are useful and that get consumed in other production processes or in consumption. And those things obviously move physically from one place to another and get added and subtracted and transformed. What enables that movement is both physical infrastructure, but also financial infrastructure, because as things move in one direction, payments move in the other. So that's just circuits of value flow. The infrastructure and the economic integrations that are emerging along the Belt and Road, for example, and across the Eurasian continent through initiatives such as the SCO, is really accelerating the circuits of value flow. The infrastructure that enables the money side to work is built on a number of layers again. One is a number of currency swap agreements between the People's Bank of China, which is the central bank of China, and other central banks in other countries. So that really deals with the issue of liquidity. Banks need to have sufficient liquidity at the end of each day to settle the accounts, and sometimes swaps are necessary to enable that to happen. On top of that, we then have to have information infrastructure that enables the sending of messages, because without secure messaging to give instructions for banks to make ledger adjustments, it's pretty hard for those ledger adjustments to be made. So independent information infrastructure is then the next layer. For a long, long time, those messages have been delivered from banks to banks via the SWIFT infrastructure. Now, the SWIFT infrastructure runs via the internet these days, It used to be on telex, of course, before the internet days. But with the internet, the data flows into the data centers in Europe, but also there is a backup or a redundant data center that operates in Virginia in North America. And that's really where the problems have emerged over the last 20 years. Off the back of the Iraq War, the American intelligence agencies ultimately prevailed in seeking access to transactions data from SWIFT to better understand and have visibility to the financing of the activities of Iraq in the first place. And then not long thereafter, the American state was able to impose its will on SWIFT to block the transmission of messages from sanctioned banks. And that was the beginning, in a sense, of the weaponization of messaging infrastructure. It's important to remember that SWIFT is really a way in which instructions are passed from one bank to another. It's actually not payments per se. It's an instructions carrying platform with standardized information, secure codes, and things like that. But once you can intervene in that process and see what the instructions are, who's telling whom to add what and minus what from ledgers, and then ultimately stopping messages from being passed, you're obviously stopping the processes of value flow from happening. So an alternative infrastructure has had to be built for that. China itself developed CIPS. Russia also developed its own. Iran's developed its own, all from about 2013, 2014 onwards. And these messaging infrastructures have now connected up a vast swathe of banks across the world who are able to communicate with each other outside of the SWIFT communications channels. So we now have agreements for currency swaps. We have communications infrastructure that bypasses the SWIFT infrastructure. In other words, it bypasses data centers in Virginia, and it enables participating banks to communicate directly with each other. We're now adding in the next layer, which is the institutional layer through things like the SCO, but not just the SCO bank, the New Development Bank, but also the New Development Bank that was created 10 years ago from BRICS. So another piece of a jigsaw puzzle is being put into place now, enabling participating countries and their commercial banks and central banks to interact with each other in environments where their common purposes and their standards and concerns are able to be activated, again, outside of an environment that the United States in particular can intervene in. So as the layers get built up, participating banks and the countries that obviously these banks come from are able to, in a sense, do their own thing. So these are just new circuits that are beyond the reach of the powers of Western states. The last layer is going to come when digital currencies in their various forms come out of trial and into the wild. And once that happens, I think we're going to see a fast tracking or an acceleration of the circuits by which the real world supply chains can be activated and real resources get mobilized. And that will boost the integration and the economic alignment of the participating nation states. It will enable them to trade more effectively with each other with much less friction, fewer transaction costs, and reduced time lags in between settlements. Now, that's important not only because everybody wants to get paid quicker, but it actually means that the amount of or the stock of money that is required to lubricate this economic system, the stock of liquidity needed is substantially lower. And from an enterprise's point of view, because payments are settled quicker, there is much less dormant capital, the cost of which enterprises are having to carry, and they are able to mobilize money capital for productive purposes. So, as I'm sure you and your audience would understand, money capital sitting still isn't really doing much good for you. And if you can transact and have that money capital moving quickly, because We're settling cross-border trade accounts quickly. We're enabling investment projects to move quickly with less money capital sitting still. We're able to turn that money capital, that liquidity in effect, into meaningful and impactful value creation.
So let me ask you a question about I guess the impact that digital trading currency, whatever form that ends up taking, will have. As you walk through this, it strikes me that change could come very rapidly once a digital currency is agreed upon enough because it works. And you look at the sort of leader, the regional hegemon in the East being China. And it's actually over 150 countries that took BRI money, not 103, as I said. It's like 80% of the world. It's a huge number. Is that leverage for adoption of a Chinese-led global currency? And is this forward-thinking engineering, which I want to get into with you in a minute, on China's part since 2013, is this just getting slightly ahead of the game? So when the time comes to roll out an alternative, highly functional global trading currency, the supply and demand rails are long in place?
Look, this is about laying out the real economy dimensions that ultimately give purpose to currencies.
Okay.
Without real economy flow, at the end of the day, we live in a world of promissory notes. Currencies are literally a form of promissory note. They're largely unconditional, as opposed to other kinds of promissory notes. But without a real economy or a real economy value foundation, what good is a promissory note? Well, it allows you to buy more promises about something in the future. But if you can't convert that into things that deliver tangible goods or services, then there really is not much value at all. And I think what we're seeing in part is the reassertion of the real economy. So over the last 30 years, with intensive financialization, particularly in the transatlantic world, we have an explosion in fictitious capital. So this idea of fictitious capital is promissory notes that provide rights to claims on future value. But if the real economy of goods and services actually can't come to the party, then what good is those particular rights? Well, then of not much use at all. So that's the first thing. So we're looking at laying real economy foundations. The second thing, though, is whether or not China has a strategic intent on enabling its own economy to in effect, act as security for a new global reserve currency. I suspect not, actually. China has consistently made it clear that it has no interest in replacing the United States. What it means by that is not just the idea of being another global hegemon, partly because it has a different view of how how China thinks the world's unfolding anyway, but partly because I think China sees the experience of the United States as global hegemon as a double-edged sword. It comes with significant costs, which are not necessarily costs that China itself thinks are worth paying, whether it's from a military cost point of view or from the point of view of being put in a position where, in effect, it's running a global trade deficits so that it can issue more RMB into the world to keep the world ticking over. Mm-hmm. It does want to improve and increase the use of RMB in the global system, but not in a way that it becomes another USD reserve currency. I say that in part because the politics of multipolarity means that I think China needs to navigate this with quite a little bit of sensibility to the other economies that are part of the global south. And they're not insubstantial economies, and they're not insubstantial countries with a strong sense of who they are and their willingness to sort of swap out of subordination to one, hegemon into, from the frying pan into the fire, if you will. So I think China is sensitive to the politics of all of this as well. What I suspect is probably more likely, and I think these are the kinds of discussions that have been taking place at both the BRICS level and now at the SCO level is the creation of what is in effect an interbank settlements unit of currency, but one which is only used as an interbank settlements instrument. So this goes back to some of the ideas that, for instance, John Maynard Keynes proposed in the early 1940s as the United States and the UK at the time were debating the structures of the post-war financial architecture. And Keynes proposed the idea of a numeraire, which is a settlements instrument that was not a national currency. And this was the idea of the Bancor. The United States at the time proposed and sought the United States dollar as the principal settlements currency of the world post-war. And by the time the arrangements were bedded down at Bretton Woods, the United States won the argument. The United States, of course, at the time, towards the end of the war, was likely to be one of the few industrial powers left standing. It was going to be a significant surplus country, and was in a very, very strong position to impose its own will onto the UK and others, and that's what happened. But I get the sense when you look at the commentary from, say, the governor of the People's Bank of China in some recent speeches that he's given, that they're really looking at a global architecture that has something that looks a little bit more like the Bancor proposition than simply replacing the US dollar with another national currency.
Okay. Thank you for that. Now, there's two directions that I want to go here from this. Maybe I'll start with this. At the SCO Summit 2025, two countries were not there. Well, many countries were not there, but two that I was thinking about might be there one day. And one is Australia. Now, I know you're based in Brisbane, and I want to get your take on this. Australia, I feel like, has been doing an efficient job at threading the needle between the US-China conflicts. And I think a statement that came out, I don't know, a few months ago was the United States is our friend, China is our customer. But to me, it's like, what does that even mean? Nothing, right? From a proximity standpoint, they're an Indo-Pacific country. And proximity matters. 30% of their exports go to China, their biggest customer. Your biggest client always matters, right? If you were to project forward, maybe 10 years into the future, is Australia participating in summits like the SCO? Are they realigning with their closer proximity neighbors who have been a bit more forward-thinking over the last couple of decades? What's your take, Warwick?
Whoa, you've put me on the spot. Look, as you say, Australia has threaded the needle with quite a little bit of diplomatic dexterity over the course of the last let's call it 15 years.
Okay.
Sometimes probably a little bit more dexterous than at other times, and I think right now, on balance, it's probably fair to say that Australia is managing to thread that needle reasonably well. There will be people who will have slightly different views of emphasis in terms of what it should or shouldn't do. But I think if we take as a starting point that Australia views itself, and I mean by that the political elite that drive public policy in Australia, the government and the sort of bureaucracy in the security and foreign affairs world, their general view of the world is that Australia has an alliance in place with the United States, the ANZUS alliance. Australia has security dependency on the United States, which has actually been increasing over the course of the last 15 years rather than decreasing. But at the same time, as a result of China's rise, the modernisation of China's military, Australia's ongoing economic relationships with the People's Republic of China and the markets of Asia more broadly, and perhaps even to some extent a recognition that the United States is reconfiguring to some extent its role in the Western Pacific. And I'll come back to that because I think how Australia understands that is going to affect how Australia navigates the next little while. All of these things coming together is impacting on the way that Australia positions itself. For the time being, Australia will continue to seek to straddle this fence. Um, I described it once not so long ago as having one foot on either side of a barbed wire fence, and one careless step could lead to some injury. So far, I think over the last, say, 10 years or so, there have been a couple of moments where there have been some missteps that has caused some injury, not huge injury, but some scratches. But so far, Australia has survived that. The issue is actually what others do far more so than what Australia does, because in some respects, how Australia positions itself is going to be dependent upon where the United States ends up in 10 to 20 years' time in this region. And how the rest of the region also responds to all of that. So it's a multi-actor game, if you will. See, Australia not only deals with China in the region, but it also has to deal with the rest of Asia. And the rest of Southeast Asia has actually a relatively mature approach to the emergence of China, in part because it's got centuries of experience, arguably millennia of experience in dealing with a very, very big China. We've discussed the Philippines in the past in terms of its current sort of positioning, but the Philippines aside, the other members of ASEAN actually have, interestingly, I think, far more relaxed attitudes about how to deal with a growing China than, say, Australia does, and Australia is a lot further away. The issue then boils down to where the United States is going to be. Now, the United States has been, I think, engaging in a process of restructuring the way that it postures towards Asia. And part of that restructuring involves a certain kind of retrenchment. Now, this retrenchment is not a full-scale backing out of Asia, far from it. In fact, it's a reconfiguration of responsibilities and first-line responsibilities. And it's done that by progressively reforming a posture, which has been a hubs and spokes relationship that it's had in bilateral terms with a bunch of security partners, to creating a series of mini laterals where it can seek to have its allied partners working closely with each other, with the United States being able to take one step back, push the others to the front to take primary responsibility, both in terms of financing. So Australia's up for financing substantial American requirements in Australia. So there's substantial developments of naval port facilities in Western Australia, for example, to accommodate American nuclear submarines. Whether or not Australia ever gets nuclear submarines, American nuclear submarines will be able to use those facilities in essence as a permanent base. So the allied countries are being pushed to do a lot more. Allied countries also, particularly ones closer to China, in particular the Philippines and to some extent Japan, are also being pushed to take on a lot more frontline responsibility. And with that responsibility comes substantial frontline exposure and risk. So the US, in some respects, I think, is taking that step back. Interestingly, I think in the last 10 days or so, we've seen reports in Politico, I think from memory, talking about a draft defense policy being circulated in the Pentagon that is indicating that certainly there's a debate happening in the Pentagon that perhaps the United States really needs to commit far more resources than it even thought it would have to 5 years ago to the Western Hemisphere, and the ambitions that it may have had in relation to the Western Pacific are even going to have to take a further backwards, take a back seat. Let's see where this all ends up. I don't know where well, I'd call them defense secretary, but he's actually the war secretary now, isn't he?
That's right.
Where the war secretary ends up on all of this. So you'll recall that 2011 we had the Obama pivot to Asia, which never really took root because of the continual demands from other parts of the world. putting pressure on American resources, and ultimately the outbreak of war in Europe and also in West Asia has really, I think, shown some of the material limitations and constraints that are now impinging on American ambitions of global primacy. So it's never, in a sense, been able to fully execute this pivot. Because of that, it has been putting more pressure on its regional partners and allies to step up, both from a financing point of view, though, as we were discussing before, you can finance all you want, but if the production systems can only do so much, they can only do so much, and all that'll happen then is the prices will rise, and that has been what's happening. So military industrial enterprises, particularly those listed on the stock exchange, are reaping the benefits of all of this. Their productive capacity really isn't increasing dramatically, but their ability to take forward orders and use forward orders to undertake structured finance is benefiting their financial bottom lines. So that's where I think Australia's at. In some regards, the issue will come to the extent to which in 10 to 20 years' time the United States really is a less prominent part of this region. And if the United States is a less prominent part of this region, which I believe that is likely to be the case, then Australia will quietly, I suspect, adjust its posture. So a prominent Australian analyst, Hugh White, Professor Hugh White, actually makes a strong case that this is an inevitability, that the United States will not be, or in fact is not, an Asian hegemon today, and that Australia is going to have to simply come to grips with living in an Asia in which China is the dominant power. End of story. That's where it's going to be. I suspect he's right. And so the debate that's unfolding at the moment, in part, is between some who want to deny that possibility or at best defer it, trying to hold the US in the region as long as they can, hoping that maybe something will change. Others are actually saying, and it's not just Hugh White, there are others now saying, look, China's a long way away. The burden of proof sits with those who keep talking about or implying that China is a threat to Australia militarily. No one's actually explicitly argued why that's the case. And as a consequence of all of this, the entire defence posture is going to need a comprehensive overhaul once these realities set in. So rather than 10 years, perhaps, Jay, if we look 20 years ahead, the entire environment will be quite different, and I'm reasonably confident that Australia will, at that moment in time, dexterously, as it's always done, modify its position.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, and just for anybody who caught that, when Warwick mentioned the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, the Ministry of Defense has been rebranded to the Ministry of War, which some people might find dystopian or pessimistic. You could also just call it being honest. It is what it is. But that was that reference. You mentioned some potential conversations happening in the Pentagon, encouraging American military policy to double down on the Western Hemisphere and maybe retract a little bit from the Eastern Hemisphere. And so we'd be looking through North America, South America, Europe, to sort of protect our regional hegemon status, because maybe that's at risk right now, instead of spreading ourselves too thin, trying to dismantle another regional hegemon in the East, which is China. And so where Australia would land in that, because from a proximity standpoint, they are in the Indo-Pacific. And Hugh White's stance, if I have it correct, is that Australia will be able to stay neutral. And is that correct, that they could find themselves in a position of neutrality if they play their cards right? They're strong enough to do so and won't have to align with East or West, but instead just align with Australia. Is that accurate?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'd hate to speak on behalf of someone as preeminent as Hugh White, but my understanding of his position is essentially that Australia won't be able to, and in fact can't depend upon the US
Right.
anymore, even today. And therefore, it is going to need to develop a more independent posture. And by doing so, an effect of that is a kind of neutrality. I think that there's a lot going for the idea of Australia um, reshaping itself and forming a foreign policy that sees itself more explicitly in neutral terms. You know, neutrality isn't simply a question of not picking side A or side B. Neutrality, I think, is actually a very legitimate position. It's called picking side C, and side C is one that can advance a whole bunch of other um, active interventions in a region that seeks to contribute to the building of institutions that consolidate peaceful relationships between states and which can act in ways that contribute to, if not mitigating tensions and conflicts, can certainly help ease tensions and conflicts where tensions and conflicts arise. Australia's challenge now, and many in Southeast Asia uh, are very mindful of this, is that even though geographically it's fairly and squarely within the Asian region, it's not seen by the countries of Asia and the peoples of Asia as being particularly Asian at all. And that does, I think, at a certain level, affect the extent to which Australia can play that kind of constructive role, which I think a country like Australia, with its economic solidity, its wealth, and its ability to contribute in lots of different ways, economically and socially in the region, it could play, I think, a more constructive role from a position of neutrality. But because it's seen and is, in effect, an American ally, there is a little bit of wariness about whether or not Australia is speaking for Australia or whether Australia is speaking for Australia as a sub-imperial
Right.
nation.
Okay. And there's an excellent debate recently between Hugh White and John Mersheimer. Just if you want to hear more about this specific topic, it's a great 25-minute conversation. The second country I wanted to ask you about, and then I'll move on to the next subject here, Warwick, is Japan. Very similar scenario from a proximity standpoint, incredibly energy dependent. And whenever a country is energy dependent, to the extent that Japan is, like think Sri Lanka in 2021, everything can fall apart very, very quickly, especially with a currency as vulnerable as Japan's. And the majority of their energy comes from the Middle East and coincidentally Australia. Same question with Japan. Where do they find themselves today? Is this a country we should expect to see at the SCO in the coming decade?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, we've touched on it in one of our last discussions in terms of what's going on in North Asia. And the more I've thought about it, the more I think that the potential for Japan to, in a sense, become the Far Eastern anchor of an SCO or an SCO plus is actually quite real. Certainly not tomorrow, but in 20 years' time. And the principal reasons revolve around the material conditions of Japan. It's food import dependent, and it's also energy dependent. Now, that part of the world, Northeast Asia, has tremendous food and energy resources that can alleviate a lot of the issues that Japan has, particularly going forward. I think that there are also tremendous opportunities for Japan to exploit a better relationship with China, particularly in the area of renewables, not for renewable energy's sake, but to actually consolidate and accelerate Japanese capabilities in downstream energy technology such as hydrogen. The Japanese have developed some very advanced capabilities in this arena, but what really makes hydrogen work is cheap upstream energy. And once you can get marginal costs down to net almost zero, then you've transformed hydrogen. And if you can do that, that will then lead to, I think, a very substantial transformation in Japan's own sense of security. right? So again, looking forward, not tomorrow, but 10, 20 years' time, it wouldn't surprise me if strategic thinkers in Japan are starting to think about how it can be more energy sovereign. And part of that is going to be finding a pathway to reconnecting both economically, but in the end institutionally with its Northeast Asian neighbours. Now, today that's difficult. And I don't mean China per se, because Japan, interestingly, like other countries in Asia, have the ability and demonstrated a capacity to have a very pragmatic relationship with China. It's not to say that there are some in the Japanese security establishment who don't hold fears about China, but nonetheless there is a pragmatism that is evident as well. Not excessively ideological, a capacity to work together. They're talking about getting the tripartite free trade agreement, including Korea, back on track, for example. And so I think, you know, the Japanese people and the Japanese political establishment are wise to the fact that where things have been historically, meaning the post-war history, are highly unlikely to be what the future looks like. And again, this is going to come down to the medium-term outlook for American military presence in the region. You know, American troops are on Japan, of course, which creates a distinct constraint on Japanese maneuverability, and that needs to be something that gets resolved at some point in time, and that's not going to get resolved tomorrow. It's a bit like the role of America in NATO. That's not going to get resolved tomorrow, because unraveling all of that without something else in place creates risks for countries, and they'll be very reluctant to expose themselves to those sorts of risks. But throw yourself forward 20 years, what does a sovereign, secure Japan look like? Well, a sovereign, secure Japan is going to potentially look like a country that is deeply connected into Northeast Asia, and that includes Siberia, Russia, Korean Peninsula, and China, with an energy security that comes from enhanced hydrogen, possibly also safer and better next generation nuclear power as well.
We covered the China-Taiwan dynamic in depth in our last conversation, so we don't need to revisit the history of that, aside from saying, as we summarized, or as you summarized, it's effectively legally a stalemate civil war between the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. And that's sort of the legal grounds for what Taiwan is. I think out of 197 countries in the world, 11 recognize Taiwan's independence. Maybe a couple more sit on the fence, but it's a small minority and it's shrinking. Can I ask you a pointed question? Very similar question to mine about Japan and Australia. Do we see the reunification of China, Taiwan this decade in the 2020s?
Probably not. Now, these 11 countries, by the way, don't recognize Taiwan's independence. They recognize the Republic of China.
Thank you for that. Being the island of Taiwan.
No, being the Republic of China, that happens to be domiciled on the island of Taiwan, but which has a claim over the rest of China. So they still recognize one China.
Right.
Just a different one China.
Yes, thank you for that. Okay.
So there isn't actually a country in the world that recognizes Taiwan as an independent country in and of its own right. They've just landed on a different side of the Civil War, basically. Look, I don't think that there will be reunification in the next 5 years, though stranger things can happen. In large part, I think the course of the last 12 months in particular, a combination of what's been unfolding in Ukraine and what's happening in Washington, has shaken Taiwanese sensibilities. And there is a discernible shift in public attitudes, not one that clamours for reunification, but one that has, I think, taken a backward step from any considerations of moving towards independence. The political forces that are pro-independence have experienced a couple of significant defeats in the last few months, both in terms of the recall referenda that that they initiated, and also, interestingly, on the voluntary and non-binding referendum on the nuclear power question. And both of those referenda or votes went very badly against the independence forces. Now, unsurprisingly, those forces have spun quite hard to say that these weren't related to the question of mainland China itself. But no one believes that, because during the campaign for the recall, the pro-recall campaign explicitly said that this was what the question was about. So there has been a strong rebuff. One of the reasons for that, I think, is well, it's the combination of reasons. One is actually a realization that perhaps the United States has its own priorities. It's got its own things to deal with. And the fate of the Republic of China or the fate of Taiwan is possibly not high on that list, push come to shove. And so that's the lesson that's coming out of observing the events in Ukraine. Many observers have sort of talked about, how Beijing might view, what's happening in Ukraine, whether it's that it will become encouraged by it, or if the West isn't strong in backing Ukraine, Beijing will then feel it can do X, Y, and Z. I think the more interesting reaction is actually what's happened on the island itself, which is, again, a realization that perhaps the big protector that people thought was going to be there and able to come and defend them actually is in no position to do any of that. So one is that Washington itself has its own problems and its own priorities, but secondly, it's just straight material wherewithal. The capability of the American military to defend the island is actually just not real. The air defense systems that supposedly, were going to, keep the Russians at bay have simply failed. The long-range missiles that were somehow going to, be able to fight back simply aren't there in sufficient number. Number one, can't be replaced when used, and aren't effective anyway. So these are some of the realities that I think are really starting to dawn on people. And as I said, look, I don't think that this leads to a clamouring of people suddenly wanting reunification, but I think it has shifted the politics on the island away from independence. And if things get shakier, continue to get shakier, then I wouldn't be surprised if there are more activated calls from people on the island for a re-engagement with Beijing. Right? Those engagements haven't taken place for quite some time. Beijing refuses to engage with the current administration on the basis that the current administration refuses to agree to the 1992 consensus, which is that there is one China. And so there are no talks. But I wouldn't be surprised if at some point over the next 5 years, the demand for talks grows, number one, that there are more cross-strait interactions. We're seeing that with, former presidents, notional presidents of the ROC visiting the mainland. We've seen that with social media influencers visiting the mainland. And the other part of the discussion that I would expect to take place, but much quieter, is going to be at a military to military level. I mean, I think as we've discussed before, and as I'm sure you know, most military people are actually the ones most reluctant to engage in war. It's the armchair warriors who seem to be the ones who want to throw everyone else's children into warfare.
Always.
But the people who are actually the professionals try to do everything that they can to avoid this. And I wouldn't be surprised if we have a lot more military to military back channel discussions, because that's got to lay the groundwork. Because if you think about what a possible reunification discussion needs to deal with? Well, the question of how the militaries resolve their standoff, number one, and then eventually integrate needs to be dealt with. Right? Foreign policy, national defence, they are the big ones, and the militaries will need to talk to each other around that. So that's where I think it's at. No unlikely, highly unlikely for there to be reunification per se in the next 5 years, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's actually much more talk about engaging today rather than leaving things too late.
Okay. For my last question, I want to actually just put a concept in front of you. It's a conversation that I've noticed online over the last couple of weeks, and I'm failing to remember the name of the analyst who I first heard it from, but he's been on Navarro Media, Interesting Times. Anyways, we were having this discussion internally via IC Media. I kind of framed it in simple terms. I just want to get your thoughts on this. When we compare the cultures of, I'd say, the East and the West, but really I'm talking about the United States and China. And, the question comes down to infrastructure. Why can China build nationwide high-speed rail, as an example, in less than a decade? Well, California can't build a single route in over 20 years. And this might come down to culture. China operates like a state of engineers. The United States operates like a state of lawyers. And in China, leaders are trained to think like engineers. And the majority of provincial leaders, I believe, are trained in engineering or the natural sciences. And as a result, problems are viewed as technical puzzles to be solved with big projects and executed quickly. And that's why they churn out bridges, rail, factories at breakneck speed. We've all read stories about the dozens of uninhabited ghost cities in China. And I joke that the US government prints money, the Chinese government prints condos. It's a different take on the same kind of stimulus. But if China is a nation of engineers, the United States is dominated by lawyers, and every single Democratic vice president and president since 1980, with the only exception of Al Gore, went to law school. And as a consequence, every big project in the US faces a gauntlet of reviews, lawsuits, and regulations. This slows everything down and kills ambitious ideas. But it also prevents catastrophic overreach and protects individual rights. And this is important. So let me explain why. The engineering mindset that seems to be very prevalent in Chinese politics is carried into social engineering as well. And when you approach social issues like engineering problems, you might end up with disastrous outcomes like the one-child policy or zero COVID. People are more than economic inputs, and overlooking that tends to lead to an abundance of unintended harm. So while China dazzles with speed and scale, but they risk engineering their society into somewhat of a predicaments, America frustrates with delays, but avoids the self-inflicted wounds of social engineering. Do you think what do you think of this summary of Chinese political culture and American political culture, and why these two economies are moving at vastly different speeds? One excels towards building solutions, and one excels towards saying no, which is what lawyers are really, really good at, is blocking things from happening. What's your take, Warwick?
Yeah, this is the Dan Wang argument, right? So
that's right. That's his name. Thank you for that.
Yeah. I don't buy it at all.
Okay.
In part because Wang himself talks about the Roosevelt administration as being full of lawyers who are capable of building things, right? So the idea of this reductive dualist framework, that somehow you can reduce national competency to essentially the occupational types of a group of leaders, I think is way too arguably simplistic, but I think probably more importantly, a little bit misleading in the way that it frames the institutional environment in which different things are prioritised and different kinds of problems are addressed. And there are other examples, so I'll try and just tackle them one by one. China is a country that emerged from 100 years of war with devastated infrastructure, very, very low living standards, and life expectancy of less than 40 years of age. Right, so this was 80 years ago. In that environment, it sought to find ways of solving social and economic problems in the context of an ambitious revolution at the same time. And it did that through drawing on all sorts of frameworks of dealing with the world. Some of those came from, I guess you'd say, the socialist connections that it had, particularly with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, of course, had a strong background in science, technology, infrastructure, engineering. Now, China had to build things. It didn't have many power stations. It didn't have many roads. Its railway network was, of course, in place, but it needed to be expanded. So it had to learn how to build things anyway. The social aspects, I think, are kind of interesting, right? Because this idea of social engineering, as a phrase, comes with a lot of baggage, right? But part of the political reactions in the United States today seems to me to be a reaction to a whole bunch of social engineering that a certain political perspective has reacted to. And I'm talking about, views concerning equity and those sorts of things, right? Equity, accessibility, or whatever.
Yeah.
The idea that the US somehow hasn't been involved in social engineering in its own way seems a little bit far-fetched. And in fact, I think you could argue that those who have a sensibility to the law are actually well equipped to describe and segment and categorize people in all sorts of ways that lends itself to various forms of classifications. And from that, supports ways in which societies seek to engineer outcomes. For the past 300 years, actually, governments around the world, particularly in Europe to start off with, and in more recent times, China has sought to view the population as a resource. Right? So, and it has done that through the interventions of providing things like education. Sunday schools. Why were Sunday schools introduced? Well, partly to ensure that working class people could read and write, working class kids. Why did that have to happen? Well, because they needed to have them work in factories. Why was there the emergence of public health initiatives? Well, not because there was anything particularly kind about the world, but because there was an attempt to engineer a capable and healthy workforce to go and work in industry. So there has always been an attempt to engineer outcomes concerning populations. Sometimes they've been explicit. So if you took the one-child policy, which is the one that Dan Wang uses in the book. He describes it as his favourite chapter. The one-child policy was implemented for about 30-odd years. And was it a case of social engineering? Let's put the pejorative rhetoric aside and let's understand the context, I guess, of this policy response. That policy emerged in an environment where there were concerns about adequacy of food to feed people, concerns about the adequacy of medicine to deal with people as they got sick. So there was some genuine concerns at the time that China did not have the ability to actually deal with a rapidly growing population, number one. In bringing population growth in check at that time, remember, it was dealing with certain kinds of problems. At that time, it created the foundations demographically that enabled it to then experience the last 40 years of economic growth that it did. There are, of course, consequences to that, and we all know what they are, which is an imbalance, gender imbalance in society. And also, there's no doubt that in parts of the country, zealous implementation of policies led to some very bad experiences for many women. Okay, so all of that's also true. But what one kind of doesn't really mention is the fact that up until the 1970s, the United States actually sanctioned eugenics-based programs that were based on race, which was to sterilize people on racial terms. So who was social engineering whom and why. My point really is that I think these dualisms don't help us understand places that well. China has been compelled through its circumstances and its way of thinking about its economic development and social development problems and challenges to address this issue of infrastructure deficit. In Chinese thinking, there has long been a saying that if you want a place to get rich, you need to build roads first. Because if you can't connect places to other markets, you're never going to be able to create wealth, right? So isolated villages in the middle of nowhere in the mountains don't get wealthy because you can't get things to them and they can't get their things to market. So it's a big, complicated country. Complicated meaning that it's geographically and topographically really complicated. Deserts, mountains, big rivers, gorges. It's and lowlands. It has plenty of earthquakes. It floods. Does all of this stuff. So it invariably, if it has an ambition to develop, it has to become good at certain things. The fact that the leadership, the cadre, have engineering and science backgrounds, I think speaks a lot more to a sensibility, particularly in that 1950s, 1960s period, which was, we're a poor country. We've got to build stuff. We need to know stuff. We've got a population that dies on average at the age of 39, right? So we need to actually get our heads around medicine. We need to get our heads around roads, rails, bridges. We need to get our heads around energy. And I suspect that it's got a lot more to do with that than just some idea that, China's a bunch of engineers and America's not. I guess the last thing I'll say on this, Jay, is that I think this has a lot more to do with, two things. Firstly, I think it has a lot to do with the ways in which national leaders now frame problems and what their priorities are. So China is still very much geared to a political framework that revolves around the idea of economic development. Mm-hmm. It remains a relatively poor country once you get away from the larger cities, and there are still massive challenges as far as servicing and creating opportunities for hundreds of millions of its people. When China says that it's raised 800 million people out of extreme poverty in the last 30 to 40 years, we have to remember that that's from a population of 1.4 billion people. We're talking about 600 other million people as well, right? But bringing 800 million people out of extreme poverty does not mean yet that we have 800 million middle class, right? So I think there's a frame of a set of problems. The United States has, I think, a very different political culture, and it's not one that's pro or anti-building things, but it's one that ultimately has been framed largely around selling a dream, right? So the United States sells a dream a lot more. It has become a nation that's been a lot more, particularly in the last 30 years, focused around its standing in the world and how it can impose its values, right? And building a military around that. At a structural level, and I think that this is probably the other thing to remember about China and the United States, is that one of the key differentiating points between the Chinese economic system institutionally is the fact that finance is publicly controlled. In the United States, it's not. So public finance, and I don't mean the central bank, I mean the policy banks, are able to provide substantial liquidity support to certain kinds of activities and objectives and take a long view. So infrastructure requires a long view, whereas in the United States, finance has evolved in a way that is a lot more focused around quarterly reports and profiting through trading of promissory notes, right? So the financialization of the United States actually, I think, has a lot more to do with the fact that it doesn't build things. Finance dances to a different tune in the United States compared to finance in China.
I'm really glad that I asked you that. So thank you for adding context because yes, Dan Wang is his name. And he's been making the rounds on the podcast tour. And I've been listening to some of his interviews. A couple quick points to recall from that is that it's easy to reflect on maybe zero COVID or the one child policy. But that's cherry picking your indignation when you consider that over the last 30 years, 800 million people have been raised out of poverty, and no country has become prosperous to that extent so quickly ever, I believe, in the history of the world. And, other evidence like the participation at the SCO just recently, over 20 members. China's influence is still growing and rapidly. And any idea that the United States does not participate in social engineering is just false. You can find recent examples like DEI or more historic examples like eugenics, much more troubling example, and both very real. Thank you for that. I'm really glad that I asked you that question, and I appreciate your thoughtful response. Warwick, it's so good chatting with you. Whenever I have you on the podcast, my head's just buzzing. I learn a lot. I really appreciate your perspective. Thanks so much for making the time today.
It's a pleasure as always, Jay. You ask the best questions.
I appreciate that. I appreciate it. Well, until next time, enjoy Brisbane. And I know you're off to Africa very shortly, so safe travels and we'll catch up soon.
Great. Thank you.